Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I am going to be responding to a comment I received on my video, which was a response to Matt Christensen's view on natural law and natural rights. Now, I just want to say that if you made this comment, you know who you are. I don't know if people like or don't like being called out, so I decided not to name this individual in this video. But I will say that I thought that your opinion was very respectable, and I thank you for making it in a very cordial manner, and for that, thank you very much, and much respect to you. So anyway, let's get right into the comment. Nature most certainly has a morality to it, though humans are the only beings who can conceive and understand it. I'll use theft as an example. Theft is a universally bad behavior across all living organisms. Theft is a concept and behavior that emerges from the existence of property. There is no single organism, human, reptile, flora, etc., that would prefer to have their property stolen. For if that was the case, theft would not exist. Furthermore, in all places in nature, you'll find that the various organisms who are susceptible to theft react to it with some sort of force or violence. All living organisms try to stop their respective thieves from taking their property. A spider will bite you if you attack its egg sac, and a Texan will shoot you if you break into his house. Now, don't misunderstand that theft is a behavior that exists in nature, but nature also tries to stop the behavior with force. Now, on the other hand, mutualism is a universally preferable behavior, and nature seems to only promote mutualism. In this way, we can see that a morality can be formed from naturally occurring, universally preferable and undesired behaviors. Human society functions exactly the same. There's not a single surviving society that operated in violation of universally preferable behaviors. If you use your property to improve the lives of your fellow group mates, and they do likewise, you both succeed and attain greater property. If you commit the universally undesired behavior of theft against your fellows, you will be met with force or violence, just the same as meerkats stealing from others in their pack. Thus, morality is certainly found in nature, and nature promotes it through universally preferable behaviors. I don't think it's any coincidence that the particular species that are best at respecting universally preferable behavior and optimizing it have been the most powerful and successful organisms on the planet. That species is, of course, mankind, and that is without a doubt self-evident. Now, of course, the problem that I have with this, so first of all, it doesn't really get over the point where you would have to justify nature in itself. As I said, that if you cannot justify nature, nature cannot justify you. And you might ask, in what way? And that is because it assumes that theft is undesirable. Now, you might say that certainly if property exists, that taking away property involuntarily is theft, and I would say that that is categorically true. But here's a question. Should people in the first place have property, and what is wrong with taking away somebody else's property involuntarily? Now, you might say that such actions, especially among a group, detrimentally affect the group, but to which I say then, why should the group have any benefit? Or you might say that the group will then respond against you and detrimentally affect you. To which I say, why should you be concerned with your own well-being? In other words, what this fails to address is the problem of evil. In other words, justice as a concept requires that there exists a good and an evil. Now, while you can say that certain courses of action are better than other courses of action, especially if you're trying to achieve a particular goal, that does not follow, or it does not follow from that certain other actions are therefore immoral because they harm towards that goal. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that this ultimately leaves it all up to interpretation. And by leaving it up to interpretation, it does not really have an objectivity to it. For example, let's say that for some time I decide to go with my idea that operating mutually with others has a long-term advantage. But what if at some point I realize that an egoist action in a particular time would actually be more beneficial for me in the long term than a mutual action at that time? In that case, it would make sense to take the egoist action, because I obviously, being myself, consider myself to be important. Perhaps. I might not, in fact. In fact, this goes to the entire other end as well. Because what if I decide that perhaps my existence is not something that I'm very happy with? What if I decide that instead of trying to go to improve my own future or the future of others around me, I instead want to ruin the lives of everybody around me and perhaps provoke a reaction for them to kill me? And there are people that do that. So the question then becomes, what is wrong about that? And without actually having a way to determine what exactly is immoral about taking actions that are negative, then there's no real point. And this goes furthermore. For example, the idea of human life itself. Is human life valuable? Should it be valuable? And if it is valuable, why should we not squander it? And this goes further and deeper onto every single idea of a right, because you could say that people have a right to property, but I could say that sure, people can have property, but what if I want that property and I can get away with it? Then ultimately, your property rights, sure, you might be able to defend them, but what if you can't? Then I can just take your property and be well. And so what I'm trying to say here is that this idea actually presupposes that there are morals beforehand. In other words, this idea presupposes the idea of prosperity or of property rights or of, let's say, self-perpetuation. But what I'm saying is that without actually establishing why those things are important and why those things are good in themselves, then you cannot justify how nature brings those things together and then determines those to be good. Because as I just said, someone else can take nature and come away with a completely different interpretation. Because what you see is that there are animals that are very good at predation and that perpetuate themselves in every generation by predating other animals, such as parasitic wasps, for example. So in that sense, it makes sense to say that looking at nature, it is not something that ultimately can give us an ought from its ises. So that's why I decide to, instead of trying to get oughts from ises, I just get an is from an is. In other words, what I say is that a government establishes a particular system of justice, and that if you oppose that system, then to that government you become evil. Therefore, it is relative. However, it is relative based upon an actual real power. Similar to, from a religious perspective, one could say that if there is, hypothetically, an omnipotent deity that will judge everyone, therefore violating the precepts of that deity will ultimately be evil and towards that deity, which means that deity, therefore, in its own system of justice, is justified in punishing he who violates it. And that's the principle of my system of ethics, which actually functions because it doesn't require you to make a particular generalization or interpretation of something that is very abstract, such as whether or not life should be valuable in the first place, because what you have instead is that there is someone who makes laws, and that those laws are things that apply to the world. And we see this historically as well. What we see is in the wild, what we see is the powerful, the strong, generally predate upon the weak. We see this in, for example, a pack of hyenas can get together, and the strength of their intimidation can push away a lion from its prey, and then the hyenas eat. Or a despot comes together with a band of men, and they go and subjugate a village, and therefore the tyrants win, and the tyrants can win again and again. And that's what we see with many of the largest empires in history. You see Alexander the Great, you see Cyrus the Great, you see individuals who, for example, Napoleon attempted to do this, but of course he was opposed by other powerful entities that, when they got together, were more powerful than him. So in other words, the idea that the group will punish you is an acknowledgement of essentially this idea of an overwhelming power, and in this case a power that has an intention behind it, coming and actually punishing you for what it considers to be unjust. In that case being the group, in other cases being the government, in other cases being one's parents, in other cases perhaps being a deity. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that this does not actually prove nature in itself to be good, or nature in itself, therefore, to have an ability to judge people. Because you could say that naturally doing things that are physically impossible, or attempting to do such things, generally will fail, and therefore you're being punished by nature by doing those things. But what I will say is that when we're talking about generally actions that are considered more moral, many a tyrant has died, and has died peacefully, that is, and has had his empire outlast him for many generations. So how are we to say that such an individual is wrong in what he has done if he has not been punished by nature? And therefore, the idea of justice requires not only moral precepts, but also the ability to actuate them. In other words, what I'm saying is that, sure, you can look at nature and you can find this, that, and the other thing that can tell you maybe what things work and what things don't work, but if you don't actually have the power to apply those things, it's actually irrelevant what you get out of it. And that is why, and that is actually precisely why, John Locke and Thomas Aquinas both rooted their understanding of natural law in their religious beliefs and in their consciences. Because without those, their arguments would not stand up at all. Because their arguments require that there is an ultimate judge for those actions which violate nature. In other words, their ideology requires that nature is indeed created and implemented as an order upon human society, and that therefore the violation of it has a particular punishment. In other words, they were trying to take their pre-existing ethics and were trying to generalize them and make them more viable to individuals that perhaps had different religious viewpoints by attempting to root those in nature. Now, what I will say is that ultimately, I think that this is simply a bit of an obfuscation on the part of John Locke and Thomas Aquinas, because what they do is they essentially take one thing that is very clear, that is to say, their actual religious doctrine, and instead place it aside and make as a standard what is more open to interpretation. That is to say, the natural world and the world of logic and reason, which ultimately require some form of root in real power to actually be applicable. In other words, you can say that theft is wrong all you want, but if nobody's going to punish it, then what is the value of your words? The answer is that there is very little value in them, because if you cannot actually persuade those in power to punish it, then those individuals who committed the theft got away with it. And if they got away with it, and if they got away with it ultimately and in the very end, then were they wrong at all? Because then there is no justice. And I think that's something that's very important. So anyway, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I'm very happy that people are being very respectful and that we can all have a reasoned discourse, one that is without name-calling and without other such things. So anyway, if people appreciate what I'm saying, keep me out of a poorhouse, donate on Patreon. But thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Anavultus over and out.